Did you ever wonder what it was really like to be a student centuries ago? Did you ever think about the grim reality of daily life beyond the dusty scrolls and flickering candlelight, especially when sickness came calling? Did you ever picture the unseen struggles, the constant battle for survival in the bustling, often unsanitary world of medieval European universities and monastic schools, say from the 12th to the 15th century? Number 7. Scabies and lice. Itch began subtly, a tiny prickle on the wrists. Then spreading to the arms, the torso, a relentless, maddening sensation that stole sleep and concentration. For a medieval student, sharing a cramped room in a scholar's lodging or a dormitory within a monastery, the constant companions of academia were not just books and quills, but also the myriad tiny creatures that called human skin and hair home. Scabies, caused by the microscopic Sarcoptes scabiei mite, was an unwelcome guest, burrowing into the skin and laying eggs, leaving behind an intensely itchy rash. The rash often appeared as tiny red bumps or blisters, sometimes forming faint lines where the mites had tunneled. This was not a quick affliction. It was a persistent torment that could last for weeks, months, or even years if left untreated, or more likely if it was treated ineffectually by the limited medical knowledge of the time. A student afflicted with scabies found little respite. The itch was worse at night, disrupting the already sparse hours of sleep in a hard bed. During the day, in the lecture hall, or while copying texts in a scriptorium, the urge to scratch was overwhelming, an invisible burden on concentration. A student might find himself subtly rubbing an arm against a desk or shifting uncomfortably on a stool, trying to alleviate the torment without drawing too much attention. The signs were often clear. The telltale rash, the agitated movements, the raw skin from constant scratching. The disease spread easily through close physical contact, sharing blankets or even brushing against another student in a crowded space. In the tightly packed living conditions of a medieval university, where students often slept 2 or 3 to a bed or shared sleeping mats on the floor, the spread of scabies was almost inevitable. A new arrival from a rural village might bring it to the city, or a student returning from a holiday at home might reintroduce it to his fellow scholars. Lice were an even more pervasive and visible problem. Head lice, body lice, and pubic lice were all common, thriving in environments where personal hygiene was rudimentary by modern standards. Students, often living on a strict budget and without regular access to bathing facilities, rarely washed their hair or bodies thoroughly. Clothes were worn for weeks or months without washing, creating ideal breeding grounds for these tiny insects. Head lice were particularly common among young scholars, their eggs known as nits, clinging stubbornly to hair shafts. A student might try to comb them out with a fine-toothed comb if he was lucky enough to possess one, but the task was often futile without effective louse-killing agents. Constant itching on the scalp could lead to sores from scratching, which then could become infected, leading to further complications like impetigo or even more serious bacterial infections. Body lice lived in clothing seams, only venturing onto the skin to feed, leaving itchy red welts. These lice were especially troublesome in winter, when thick woolen garments were rarely shed or cleaned. The social stigma attached to these infestations was often profound, despite their commonality. A student with visible lice or a widespread scabies rash might be shunned by his peers, viewed as unclean or diseased. This could lead to isolation, making the already challenging life of a medieval scholar even harder. Imagine a student eager to participate in a lively debate or a philosophical discussion, constantly distracted by the relentless itching, or perhaps avoiding close proximity to his peers for fear of spreading his misery or being ostracized. He might be excluded from shared meals, from group study sessions, or from walking together to the town's common bathhouse, if one existed and was affordable. While such afflictions were widespread, the individual suffering could still be immense, both physically and psychologically. Medieval medicine had limited understanding of the causes of these parasitic infestations. They were sometimes attributed to an imbalance of humors. The four fundamental bodily fluids of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, a cornerstone of Galenic medicine, or they might be seen as a sign of spiritual impurity or divine displeasure. Treatments were often crude and ineffective. For scabies, doctors or barber surgeons might recommend topical applications of sulfur mixed with animal fat or lard, a remedy that could sometimes be effective but was often painful, malodorous, and incomplete. Other suggestions included using mercury ointment, which was highly toxic, or various herbal concoctions that provided little relief. For lice, students might try to shave their heads, a drastic measure, but sometimes the only way to achieve temporary relief from a severe infestation of head lice. They might also try to wash their hair with strong lye soap, if available, or douse it with vinegar, which could help loosen nits. But without a fundamental change in living conditions and hygiene practices, reinfestation was almost guaranteed. The cycle of infestation and reinfestation was a constant struggle in the medieval student's life. Poverty often exacerbated the problem. Many students were not from wealthy families and lived in conditions of extreme frugality. They might share clothing, blankets, and even beds out of necessity. Access to clean water was limited, and hot water for bathing was a luxury. Soap was a coarse, alkaline substance, not the gentle cleansing agent we know today, and it was often expensive. Communal nature of university life, from shared sleeping arrangements to crowded classrooms and common eating halls, provided ample opportunities for parasites to jump from one host to another. A scholar might spend his days poring over ancient texts, debating complex theological points, and diligently practicing his Latin or Greek, all while battling an unseen army of minuscule tormentors. The intellectual pursuits were often overlaid with the grim realities of medieval hygiene. Chroniclers of the era, though they rarely dwelt on such mundane but pervasive ailments, sometimes indirectly hinted at the discomforts. Accounts of students seeking medical care in university infirmaries or monastic hospitals might list general skin complaints or itching sickness. While not explicitly naming scabies or lice, these entries underscore the commonality of such dermatological woes. The sheer resilience required of a medieval student was immense. Not only did they have to master challenging academic material in a foreign tongue, often by rote memorization, but they also had to contend with an environment that constantly challenged their physical well-being. Persistent, maddening itch of scabies or the incessant crawling sensation of lice was a low-level continuous assault that wore down a student's patience and strength, making the pursuit of knowledge an even more arduous journey. Even the most dedicated scholar would find his thoughts drifting from his studies to the relentless need to scratch, or the quiet shame of knowing he carried these unwanted companions. The struggle against these tiny creatures was a silent battle, fought in the privacy of a shared room or in the restless hours of the night, a testament to the harsh realities of student life in the Middle Ages. Number 6. Dysentery, also known as the bloody flux. Imagine the cramped, crowded living spaces of a medieval university town where students lived shoulder to shoulder in lodgings, dormitories, or sometimes even in rented rooms above noisy taverns. Food was often cheap and plentiful, but not always fresh, and water sources could be questionable. Then, the first signs of trouble would begin. A sudden cramping in the belly, a churning unease, followed by an urgent, painful need to relieve oneself. This was not a simple stomach upset. This was dysentery, often called the bloody flux, due to its most alarming symptom: stools mixed with blood and mucus. This devastating intestinal infection was a common scourge in medieval Europe, particularly in urban centers where sanitation was poor and large groups of people lived in close proximity, like a university campus. Cause of dysentery: though unknown to medieval physicians, was usually bacterial, most commonly Shigella bacteria or amoebic, caused by the Entamoeba histolytica parasite. Both thrive in environments contaminated with fecal matter. In medieval towns, sewage systems were virtually non-existent. Human waste was often simply thrown into streets, collected in open privies, or discharged into rivers that also served as sources for drinking water. Wells could easily become contaminated by runoff. Food preparation was often unhygienic, with hands unwashed and food exposed to flies. A communal meal in a university hall, where hundreds of students gathered, could easily become a super spreader event if one person was infected and hygiene was lax. A simple shared cup or an unwashed piece of fruit could transmit the bacteria or parasite. Once the infection took hold, a student's life was turned upside down. The symptoms were relentless and debilitating. Frequent, agonizing bowel movements, sometimes 20 or more a day, left the body drained and weak. The abdominal pain was excruciating, often described as a twisting or tearing sensation. Fever was common, further weakening the afflicted scholar, making it impossible to focus on lectures or studies. Dehydration was a major threat, as the body lost massive amounts of fluid and electrolytes with each painful expulsion. A student could rapidly become emaciated with sunken eyes and dry lips, their strength sapped entirely. The constant need for a latrine, often an outdoor privy shared by many, or simply a bucket in a corner of a room, created an unbearable cycle of pain and indignity. The smell would be pervasive, contributing to the already challenging living conditions. For a student pursuing a demanding academic course, dysentery was a catastrophic setback. Attendance at lectures would become impossible. The ability to read, write, or concentrate on complex philosophical arguments would vanish amidst the physical agony. A student might try to fight through it for a day or two, perhaps thinking it was merely bad food, but the relentless progression of the illness would soon make any semblance of normal life impossible. They would be confined to their bed, or more likely to a corner of their shared room, struggling to retain any food or water. The fear of passing the disease to others, or of being seen in such a weakened and undignified state, might lead to self-imposed isolation. Medieval physicians, operating under the humoral theory, often attributed dysentery to an excess of black bile or an imbalance of humors. Treatments were often counterproductive. Bleeding and purging were common practices intended to rebalance the humors or expel the perceived toxins. Leeches might be applied, or the student might be given strong laxatives like senna or rhubarb, which would only exacerbate the dehydration and fluid loss. Herbal remedies were also popular, often involving astringent herbs like plantain or tormentil, sometimes mixed with opium to alleviate the pain and slow the gut, but these rarely addressed the root cause of the infection. Some remedies involve strange concoctions like ground-up animal parts or mystical incantations, reflecting the desperate search for a cure in an age of limited scientific understanding. The effectiveness of any treatment was often more a matter of luck and the body's own resilience than the physician's skill. The impact of dysentery on a student's academic career could be devastating. Weeks of study could be lost. Examinations might be missed. If the illness was severe enough, and many cases of dysentery were fatal, it could mean the end of a young scholar's life. Mortality rates from dysentery were high, especially among the very young, the old, and those already weakened by malnutrition or other diseases. While a healthy young student might have a better chance of survival than a small child, the dehydration and secondary infections could quickly overwhelm even a strong constitution. The historical records of monastic infirmaries and university hospitals often list students dying of flux or bloody flux, a stark reminder of the ever-present threat of this disease. Life in a medieval student lodging was often characterized by a lack of privacy, and an illness like dysentery made that lack acutely felt. The suffering student would be acutely aware of his impact on his roommates. The smell, the sounds of his distress. His roommates might be afraid of catching the disease themselves, creating an atmosphere of tension and fear. Communal eating arrangements where students shared trenchers of bread and often dipped their spoons into common pots of stew or pottage made the spread of such gastrointestinal illnesses rapid and widespread once an outbreak began. A single infected student returning from a holiday could unwittingly ignite an epidemic within a college or a dormitory. For a student trying to achieve mastery in Latin, law, medicine, or theology, the constant threat of such an illness was a shadow over every academic pursuit. The thought of being struck down by a debilitating disease, the indignity of the symptoms, and the very real possibility of death must have been a constant, if unspoken, anxiety. The physical act of writing, the delicate task of illuminating a manuscript, or the challenging exercise of translating Aristotle all seemed trivial when the body was racked with pain and weakness. The desire for knowledge was immense, but the struggle against the unseen forces of disease was an equally potent and often losing battle. The specter of dysentery was a reminder that even the most dedicated scholar was still deeply vulnerable to the primitive conditions of his world. Number 5. Tuberculosis, often called consumption or the White Plague. Among the students, huddled in the chilly, often poorly ventilated lecture halls of medieval universities, a more insidious enemy often lurked, silently claiming its victims over months or even years. This was tuberculosis, known in the Middle Ages as consumption, a disease characterized by a slow, wasting decline that seemed to consume the afflicted person from within. It was a common illness in crowded urban environments, particularly among younger populations, and medieval students, often living in close quarters and subjected to varying diets, were highly susceptible. The bacillus responsible for tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, is airborne, spreading through tiny droplets expelled when an infected person coughs, sneezes, or even speaks. In a room filled with dozens of students listening to a lecturer, or in a shared dormitory where students slept in close proximity, the conditions were right for its transmission. The early signs of consumption were often subtle, easily dismissed by a young scholar focused on his studies. Persistent cough, perhaps initially dry, then becoming productive with phlegm, a low-grade fever that came and went, often worsening in the evenings, night sweats that left clothes and bedding damp, a gradual loss of appetite, leading to a slow, steady weight loss. For a student, these symptoms would often be attributed to overwork, late nights, studying by candlelight, or the general stresses of academic life. He might push through, believing he simply needed more rest or better food. But as the disease progressed, the symptoms became undeniable and debilitating. Cough would worsen, becoming a violent, hacking paroxysm that left the student breathless and exhausted. The phlegm might become tinged with blood, a terrifying sign. Breathing would become increasingly difficult, a painful struggle, as the lungs became riddled with lesions and cavities. The fever would spike higher, leading to periods of confusion and weakness. The weight loss would accelerate, leaving the student emaciated, with hollowed cheeks and bright feverish eyes, giving rise to the romanticized but grim image of the consumptive. The skin might take on a pale, almost translucent quality, leading to the name White Plague. The weakness would make even simple tasks, like walking to a lecture or holding a heavy book, an immense effort. Sitting through a long discourse, focusing on complex legal arguments or theological debates, would become utterly impossible. For a medieval student, the slow decline of consumption meant a gradual withdrawal from academic life. Initially, absences might be sporadic, then more frequent, until eventually attending classes became out of the question. The student would be confined to his room, often alone, or with a few nervous roommates. The disease was highly feared, and rightly so, as it was often fatal. There was little understanding of contagion, but people intuitively knew that wasting sickness could pass between individuals. A student suffering from advanced consumption might be isolated, left to his own devices, his academic dreams slowly consumed along with his body. Medieval medical understanding of tuberculosis was based on humoral theory. It was often believed to be caused by an excess of phlegm or a putrefaction of the humors within the lungs. Some believed it was hereditary, or a result of excessive study and a sedentary lifestyle, leading to overheating of the brain, or a weakening of the vital spirits. Treatments were varied and generally ineffective. Physicians might recommend a change of air, perhaps suggesting a move to a rural area with cleaner air, but this was a luxury few students could afford. Dietary changes were common, often recommending nourishing foods like milk, eggs, or even blood, in the belief that these would rebuild the wasted flesh. Herbal remedies were plentiful, with infusions of horehound, colt's foot, or mullein suggested to alleviate the cough, though they did little to stop the progression of the disease. Bleeding and purging, common practices of the time, were also employed, but these only further weakened an already debilitated patient. The social and psychological impact on a student was immense. The slow, wasting nature of the disease meant a prolonged period of suffering and a gradual extinguishing of hope. Watching his own body betray him, seeing his academic aspirations slip away, must have been a crushing burden. The shame of being ill, the fear of contagion, and the knowledge of his impending fate could lead to deep despair. Fellow students might offer comfort initially, but as the disease lingered, their visits might become less frequent, their sympathy mixed with fear. Monastic infirmaries or university hospitals would admit such students, offering palliative care rather than a cure, making the final days somewhat more comfortable, but the outcome was rarely positive. Records from medieval times, like monastic death registers or university rolls, sometimes list students dying of consumption, phthisis, or long sickness, which are all terms for tuberculosis. The sheer number of young people affected by this disease speaks to the harsh realities of life in medieval urban centers. A student might arrive at university full of hope and ambition only to find his dreams slowly eroded by the relentless progression of this silent killer. Pursuit of knowledge in the Middle Ages was not just an intellectual endeavor. It was a physical endurance test, and tuberculosis was one of the most formidable obstacles a young scholar might encounter, a slow and agonizing end to a promising academic career. The image of the pale, coughing student clutching a book but unable to read was a grim reality in many medieval institutions of learning. Number 4. Ergotism, often called St. Anthony's fire. Imagine a student's diet in medieval Europe. For many, especially those from less affluent backgrounds or those living in monastic schools, bread was the staple, the absolute cornerstone of every meal. Often, this bread was made from rye, a hardy grain that grew well in diverse climates. But sometimes, especially after a damp harvest or during periods of scarcity, this seemingly innocuous rye could harbor a deadly secret, a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, which produced toxic alkaloids. When consumed, these toxins caused a horrifying condition known as ergotism, or more dramatically, St. Anthony's fire, due to the burning sensation it inflicted upon its victims and the patronage of St. Anthony the Great, to whom sufferers would pray for relief. The symptoms of ergotism were terrifying and multifaceted, striking the nervous system and the circulatory system. There were two main forms of the disease. The first, gangrenous ergotism, began with intense burning pain in the limbs, particularly the hands and feet. This burning sensation was excruciating, feeling as though the affected parts were being consumed by fire, hence the popular name. The limbs would then turn dark, eventually becoming black, dry, and mummified, due to the constriction of blood vessels caused by the ergot toxins. This reduced blood flow would lead to gangrene, causing the affected fingers, toes, or even entire limbs to literally rot and fall off. This was not a quick process. It was a slow, agonizing death of the tissue, often accompanied by foul smells. A student afflicted with this form would experience unimaginable pain, followed by the horrifying reality of losing body parts. Imagine a scholar whose fingers vital for holding a quill or turning the pages of a manuscript slowly withered and turned black. The second form was convulsive ergotism, equally horrifying. This form manifested as painful muscle spasms, convulsions, and tremors. The victim might experience terrifying hallucinations, delirium, and psychosis, often described as an unholy dance or a demonic possession. Convulsions could be so severe that they caused the body to contort violently, leading to broken bones or internal injuries. For a student, the onset of such symptoms would be utterly bewildering and terrifying. One moment, perhaps debating a point of theology, the next, suffering a violent seizure or seeing visions that were not there. His peers might believe him possessed by demons or suffering from divine punishment rather than a poisoned meal. The fear and confusion would be immense for both the sufferer and those around him. Ergotism outbreaks were often localized to specific regions or towns where contaminated rye was consumed. A university town, drawing its food supplies from surrounding agricultural lands, was vulnerable to such outbreaks, particularly after a bad harvest or during times of famine, when food quality might be compromised. Contamination of the rye was often due to wet weather conditions during harvest or improper storage, allowing the fungus to flourish. Students, often living on a meager diet of bread and ale, were highly susceptible to consuming large quantities of the contaminated grain. A student from a wealthier background might have access to bread made from wheat, which was less prone to ergot infestation, but for the majority, rye bread was the staple. Medieval medical understanding of ergotism was predictably limited. Physicians of the time did not understand fungal contamination or the specific toxins involved. The symptoms were often attributed to supernatural causes, an imbalance of humors, or a curse. The burning sensation was sometimes linked to humoral fires, or an excess of choler. Convulsions might be seen as epileptic fits, or as the work of devils. Treatments were largely ineffective and based on a combination of prayer herbal remedies, and sometimes the painful, desperate act of amputation for gangrenous limbs, if a barber surgeon was available and skilled enough. Pilgrimages to shrines, particularly to St. Anthony's, were common, as sufferers hoped for miraculous healing from the saint associated with this fiery affliction. Students, often deeply religious, might have sought spiritual rather than medical salvation. The social ramifications for a student were severe. A scholar suffering from convulsive ergotism, with his uncontrolled movements and terrifying hallucinations, would be an object of fear and pity, perhaps even ostracized. He would be unable to attend lectures, participate in disputations, or even function independently. For a student with gangrenous ergotism, the slow, agonizing loss of limbs would be a visible and permanent disfigurement, a constant reminder of the horrific illness. His ability to write, to read, to interact with the world of scholarship would be profoundly hampered or destroyed. The loss of a hand meant the end of his academic career, perhaps even his ability to earn a living. Historical records like monastic annals or town chronicles sometimes describe outbreaks of ignisature, or holy fire, or St. Anthony's fire, often leading to widespread death and disability. While these records do not always specify student populations, it is clear that anyone consuming the contaminated rye was at risk. The silent threat of ergotism was a constant presence in the medieval food supply, a terrifying lottery where a basic necessity could become a source of unimaginable suffering. For a student whose life was built around the intellectual pursuit, such a physical and mental collapse would be the ultimate tragedy, a stark reminder of the fragile line between life and death, health and agonizing illness. In an age where the very staff of life could turn into a poison, the burning in the limbs, the terrifying visions, the loss of digits, all were part of the dreadful cost of tainted bread in the unforgiving medieval world. Number 3. Measles or smallpox. In the bustling medieval university towns, where young scholars from diverse regions gathered, the environment was ripe for the rapid spread of infectious diseases that we now consider childhood ailments. Measles and smallpox were two such formidable foes, capable of sweeping through a population with devastating speed and leaving behind a trail of death and disfigurement. While many students might have encountered these diseases in their younger years, those who had not developed immunity were highly vulnerable, and for others, even a secondary encounter could be dangerous if their immune system was weakened. These were not mere inconveniences, they were life-threatening epidemics that could abruptly halt a promising academic career. Smallpox, caused by the variola virus, was perhaps the most feared. Its onset was often sudden, beginning with a high fever, muscle aches, and a severe headache, symptoms that could be confused with other fevers. Then, the characteristic rash would appear. Initially small red spots on the face and body, quickly progressing to raised bumps, then fluid-filled blisters that were deeply painful and itchy. These pustules would cover the entire body, including the palms of the hands and soles of the feet, and even the mucous membranes of the mouth and throat, making swallowing incredibly painful. As the disease progressed, the pustules would scab over, eventually leaving pitted, permanent scars, particularly on the face. A grim testament to survival, however. Many did not survive. Smallpox had a mortality rate as high as 30%, and often higher during epidemics. Measles, caused by the rubeola virus, also began with fever, cough, runny nose, and red eyes. After a few days, the distinctive red rash would appear, often starting on the face and spreading downwards. While generally less fatal than smallpox, measles could still lead to severe complications, especially in a population already weakened by poor nutrition or other diseases. These complications included pneumonia, ear infections leading to deafness, and even encephalitis, an inflammation of the brain which could cause permanent neurological damage or death. For a medieval student, even recovering from measles could mean a significant loss of study time and potential long-term impairment. The spread of both diseases in a medieval university setting was rapid and merciless. Students lived in crowded dormitories, ate in common halls, and attended lectures packed into small rooms. Coughs and sneezes, common symptoms of both illnesses, would fill the air with infectious droplets. A single infected student arriving from his hometown could quickly introduce the virus to an entire college. Once an outbreak began, it would sweep through the student body like wildfire, leaving few unaffected. The younger students, or those from isolated rural areas who had not been exposed before, would be particularly vulnerable. For a student struck down by smallpox or measles, the impact on his academic life was immediate and severe. Fever and delirium would make any form of study impossible. The pain of the pustules, the constant itching, the difficulty breathing or swallowing, would consume all thought and energy. He would be confined to his bed, often in a shared room, the disease spreading to his roommates. Fear of contagion would lead to isolation, with many students, and even some tutors, avoiding the sick room. In the absence of specific treatments, care was primarily supportive, keeping the patient warm, providing fluids, and perhaps applying soothing poultices to the skin to alleviate itching, though often these remedies were ineffective. Medieval physicians operating under the humoral theory, would often attribute these diseases to imbalances of the humors or celestial influences. They might try to draw out the disease with certain herbs, or by trying to induce sweating. Bleeding and purging, though counterproductive, might also be attempted. Some believed the rash needed to be encouraged to emerge fully for the disease to run its course. For smallpox, the disfigurement was often seen as a mark of divine displeasure or a test of faith. Survivors carried the lifelong scars, a visible reminder of their brush with death. For a student, such scarring could affect his future prospects, particularly if he sought a career that required a certain physical appearance, such as a cleric or a court official. University and monastic records sometimes reflect the devastating impact of these epidemics. Periods of high mortality among students or the temporary closure of institutions could be linked to outbreaks of such highly contagious diseases. For example, chronicles might mention an unusually high number of deaths in a particular year, or a sudden exodus of students from a town due to pestilence, a general term that often encompassed various widespread infections, including smallpox and measles. The loss of a student to one of these diseases was not just a personal tragedy. It was a loss to the intellectual community, a promising mind extinguished before it could flourish. The resilience demanded of a medieval scholar extended beyond academic rigor. It encompassed a constant battle against the invisible enemies of disease. Threat of smallpox, with its high mortality and terrifying disfigurement, or measles, with its potential for debilitating complications, was a stark reminder of the precariousness of life. Every cough, every fever would carry a deeper dread, a quiet fear that one of these widespread scourges had come to claim another student. The pursuit of knowledge, therefore, was always undertaken under the shadow of these ever-present, potentially fatal childhood illnesses. Number 2. Scurvy. Consider the typical diet of a medieval student, especially those not from wealthy families. It was often monotonous, centered around bread, grains, dried meat, and sometimes salted fish. Fresh fruits and vegetables, particularly during the long winter months, or in urban settings where they were expensive or unavailable, were rare luxuries. This dietary deficiency created a perfect storm for a debilitating condition known as scurvy, caused by a prolonged lack of Vichnitz, while famously associated with long sea voyages. Scurvy was a common insidious illness among landlocked populations, including students who suffered from restricted and inadequate diets for extended periods, The symptoms of scurvy developed gradually, often making it difficult to pinpoint the exact cause in an age without understanding of vitamins. The first signs might be a general feeling of weakness, fatigue, and irritability, which a student might attribute to long hours of study or lack of sleep. Then more specific symptoms would emerge. The gums would become swollen, spongy, and prone to bleeding, often turning a dark purplish color. Teeth would loosen, sometimes even falling out, making eating, already a challenge with a limited diet, even more difficult. The student's breath might become foul, adding to his discomfort. As the disease progressed, the body's ability to heal itself would be severely compromised. Old wounds might reopen, and new wounds would refuse to close. Bruises would appear on the skin with the slightest knock, and large purplish spots called petechiae or ecchymoses, caused by bleeding under the skin, would become visible, particularly on the legs. Joint pain would become severe, making movement difficult and painful. The limbs might swell, and the student would become increasingly weak and unable to perform daily tasks. Internal bleeding could occur, leading to further complications and intense pain. In severe cases, scurvy could lead to heart failure and death. For a student, the slow, relentless progression of scurvy would be a gradual decline. The early fatigue would make it hard to concentrate in lectures or on reading Latin texts. Painful bleeding gums would make it agonizing to eat the coarse bread that formed the bulk of his diet, leading to further malnutrition. The joint pain and weakness would make walking to classes or even getting out of bed a struggle. His physical appearance would worsen, with bruised skin, swollen gums, and a general look of ill health. Such a decline would severely impact his ability to study, forcing him to miss lectures and fall behind on his assignments. Medieval physicians, without knowledge of vitamins, did not understand the cause of scurvy. They might attribute it to cold and damp humors, or to a deficiency in natural heat, or to eating too much cold food. Treatments were often ineffective or based on superstition. Bleeding and purging were common, which would only further weaken an already vulnerable patient. Herbal remedies might be tried, but unless they coincidentally contained vidnite, etc., they would offer no real cure. Some observant individuals, like sailors on long voyages, had already discovered that citrus fruits, like lemons or oranges, or certain leafy greens, could prevent or cure scurvy, but this knowledge was not widespread or systematically applied in medieval land-based medicine or daily life. For a student, access to such fresh produce was often limited, especially in winter. The social impact on a student suffering from scurvy would be profound. His declining health, the visible signs of the disease like bruised skin and bleeding gums, and his increasing weakness would set him apart. He might be seen as sickly a burden on his roommates, or simply as someone too frail for the rigors of academic life. His inability to participate fully in university life, from communal meals to debates, would lead to isolation. Poverty often played a role in the diet a student could afford, and thus in his susceptibility to scurvy. Many students were supported by meager stipends or relied on charitable foundations, which often provided basic but nutritionally inadequate food. Records from monastic infirmaries or university hospitals, while not always explicitly naming scurvy, would describe symptoms consistent with the disease, such as swelling of the gums, debility, or bleeding sickness, especially during specific seasons or periods of food scarcity. The long winters, when fresh produce was almost impossible to obtain, were particularly harsh. A student who arrived at the university in the autumn, healthy and eager, might find himself battling the slow creeping onset of scurvy by late winter or early spring, his academic dreams slowly eroding with his health. Constant struggle for basic sustenance, combined with the lack of understanding of nutritional needs, made scurvy a silent but pervasive threat to the intellectual pursuits of medieval scholars. The simple lack of an orange or a handful of fresh greens could mean the difference between thriving and a slow, agonizing decline. Number 1. Malaria or the ague. Even in medieval Europe, far from the tropical climes often associated with it today, malaria was a pervasive and debilitating disease, especially in regions with marshy landscapes and warmer climates, particularly during the summer and autumn months. Known commonly as the ague or tertian fever, due to its characteristic cyclical fevers, it was caused by parasitic protozoa transmitted through the bite of infected Anopheles mosquitoes. For students in cities, near rivers, lakes, or marshlands, or those who traveled from such areas, malaria was a recurring threat that could steal weeks, months, or even years from their academic pursuits. The onset of malaria was unmistakable and terrifying. It began with an intense feeling of coldness, uncontrollable shivering that shook the entire body, leading to a sudden dramatic rise in fever. A student might be sitting in a lecture hall or copying a manuscript when a sudden chill would seize him, his teeth chattering uncontrollably despite being wrapped in blankets. This cold stage could last for an hour or more. Then, the fever would spike, often reaching dangerous levels, accompanied by a pounding headache, intense sweating, and sometimes delirium. The student would feel as though his body was burning, his mind clouded by the heat. After several hours, the fever would break, leaving the student drenched in sweat, utterly exhausted, but temporarily feeling better. This cycle, typically every 2 or 3 days for the most common forms of malaria, would then repeat, making it a relentless torment. The cyclical nature of the ague was particularly disruptive to a student's life. Just as he began to recover his strength and thought he might return to his studies, another attack would strike. The relentless cycle of chills, fever, and drenching sweats would leave him severely weakened and anemic, his body struggling to fight the parasitic invaders that multiplied within his red blood cells. The spleen and liver might become enlarged, causing abdominal pain and swelling. Chronic malaria could lead to severe fatigue, muscle wasting, and a general inability to function, let alone concentrate on demanding academic material. The memory of the previous attack and the dread of the next would hang over the student even during his brief periods of relief. For a medieval student, dealing with malaria meant long periods of incapacitation. Attending lectures was impossible during a fever bout. Reading and writing, which required concentration and physical stamina, were out of the question. The student would be confined to his bed, shivering and burning, utterly at the mercy of his body's cycles. The lost time for study would be immense, putting his academic progress at risk. Many students might be forced to withdraw from their studies for a semester, or even longer, if they were lucky enough to recover fully. For those who did not recover, or who suffered from particularly virulent strains, malaria could be fatal, especially if complicated by other infections due to a weakened immune system. Medieval physicians, like with other diseases, attributed malaria to an imbalance of humors, particularly an excess of cold and damp humors, or to pestilential miasmas rising from stagnant water and swamps. Treatments were varied but largely ineffective. Bloodletting was a common remedy, meant to rebalance the humors, but this would only exacerbate the anemia caused by the disease. Various herbal concoctions, often bitter in taste, were prescribed to combat the fever, but none possessed the specific anti-malarial properties of quinine, which would only be discovered centuries later with the introduction of cinchona bark from the New World. Some remedies involved complex rituals, prayers, or amulets, reflecting the desperation to find a cure for such a baffling and recurrent illness. The social and psychological impact on a student was significant. The unpredictable nature of the attacks meant that a student could not make reliable plans, whether for study, sessions, or social gatherings. His recurring illness would be a constant source of worry for his family and a burden for his roommates. The physical wasting, the periods of delirium, and the sheer helplessness must have been profoundly demoralizing. He would be unable to participate in debates, copy manuscripts, or attend the numerous religious services that punctuated university life. The academic community might offer some support, but ultimately, the student was left to endure the relentless cycles of the ague, hoping for a spontaneous remission that might or might not come. Historical records, such as chronicles or medical texts, frequently mention agues or fevers that coincided with warmer months and were particularly prevalent in areas prone to mosquito breeding, such as the marshy regions of Italy or the lowlands of England and France. While these records do not identify the specific parasite, the descriptions of cyclical fevers strongly align with malaria. Toll this disease took on the medieval population, including its students, was undoubtedly enormous. The pursuit of knowledge was a grueling endeavor, and for those in regions susceptible to malaria, it was a battle fought not just in the mind, but against the invisible bite of a tiny insect that could bring a scholar's world crashing down, leaving him shivering and burning in a lonely bed.